Hi, all. Welcome to Overruled. I'm Kinsey Schofield here with Jonathan Goldberg, KC, one of the UK's most highly regarded criminal defense lawyers. He's defended over 100 murder cases and worked with numerous high-profile clients over the years. So no one that we trust more with some of these headlines today. And we've had a very positive response to some of our Epstein coverage. So let's stay on track here. The UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer is facing mounting political pressure after newly released documents revealed he was warned about the reputational risks of appointing Peter Mandelson as Britain's ambassador to the United States due to Mandelson's past connections to convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Mandelson was appointed in December of 2024 and began the role in February 2025, but he was dismissed just 7 months later after deeper and more troubling links to Epstein came to light. Now, documents show senior officials, including National Security Advisor Jonathan Powell and senior Foreign Office figure Philip Barton, had raised serious concerns about Mandelson's appointment. The process itself has been described as unusually rushed, which I imagine is incredibly concerning, sitting back and revisiting the way that took place. Starmer has acknowledged the decision was a mistake and he issued an apology to Epstein's victims, though he maintains he did not know the full extent of Mandelson's relationship with Epstein at the time. Now, Jonathan, the controversy has intensified as Mandelson is now under investigation by the Metropolitan Police Service over potential misconduct in public office. Meanwhile, and we saw a lot of this today, political opponents are raising questions about transparency, pointing to two redacted sections in the government documents related to Starmer's own notes on the appointment. Once a central figure of the new Labour era, Mandelson had been brought in largely to help manage relations with the administration of President Trump. Instead, the scandal has left Starmer's judgment and leadership under intense scrutiny. There's a lot of pressure right now, Jonathan, on Starmer to resign. The Labour Party waited so long to get into power, and you really feel like he's digging his nails in. Do you think he's feeling uncomfortable, or is he just in a blissful place of delusion today?
Well, I think, Kinsey, that's probably a good description, and he's veering between the two opposite poles in all likelihood. Because I'm, of course, old enough to remember the day when ministers would resign if they were caught out in something scandalous or a bad lapse of judgment. You can remember Anthony Eden resigning. He put it down to ill health, but within weeks of the Suez disaster, for example, in 1956, you can remember Harold Macmillan, both great prime ministers, actually, much greater than Starmer, but resigning after the Profumo scandal, perhaps 10 years or so later. But nobody resigns anymore. Standards in public life are just so low. And as you rightly put it, they hang on by their fingernails. And here is this third-rater, Starmer. Trump, I think, never said a truer word than when he said, "This is no Winston Churchill." And he's blamed everybody else in sight. First, he sacked his chief of staff, a man called Morgan McSweeney. It was his fault that he'd appointed Mandelson without full information. But then only yesterday or the day before yesterday, the truth has emerged with the latest dump of Epstein papers, and in particular with the release of part only, but my heaven, a sufficient part of the internal cabinet papers leading to Mandelson's appointment within Britain. And it's absolutely apparent that the writing was on the wall, that it wasn't rocket science, that Keir Starmer was warned numerous times by the civil service and by his own closest advisors, people like Jonathan Powell, people like Barton. He was warned, don't take the risk. This will, if it goes wrong, it will redound on you, on your reputation. The man has let people down so many times in the past. He's untrustworthy. He's unreliable. You can't bank on a man like this. And despite all that, he appointed him. And one can only think the reason was that Mandelson had such a reputation as a magician in politics. He wasn't known as the Prince of Darkness for nothing. And after all, he had pretty much got Blair into power and maintained Tony Blair in power. And he just had such a reputation for the dark arts, knowing how to manipulate the press, knowing how to, if Mandelson fell in a river, he'd come up holding a fish. He's this sort of person, and he's been that way throughout his career. He's a chancer. He loves it absolutely on the edge, but he somehow manages never to fall over the cliff until this latest situation. So back to Starmer, who's blaming everybody in sight but himself. And although he's released today these apologies to the victims, it's such humbug, in my opinion. He no more cares about the victims than I care about the man in the moon. He cares about keeping the job himself. And this is just total hypocrisy. And I think the apology is not worth the words that he uttered. And I don't buy it at all. And I hope the Labour Party doesn't buy it, because only the Labour Party have the ability essentially to vote him out of office. Nobody else does, unless and until the next election, which isn't for years away as things stand. And he's very lucky, is Starmer, because although there's loads of people who would love to snatch the wizard's hat from off his head and stab him in the back, absolutely loads of people, but for various different reasons, none of them are quite in a position to do so at the moment. So he's on borrowed time, but you never know. In politics, a week is a long time, as Bismarck said, and he may yet survive it. I hope not.
I know. I feel like I've heard the should Starmer resign headline or conversation so many times that it's almost something to laugh about at this point. So I guess my question would be, because I wasn't as heavily invested in UK politics at the time. So Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and Rishi Sunak were voted out by their own party. Is that how so they technically didn't resign? They were given the boot?
Essentially, they were given the boot. And of course, they were all Conservative politicians. And in the Conservative, otherwise known as the Tory party, there's this long tradition that men in grey suits, as they put it, the men in grey suits come and tell you when your time is up. In other words, the chief whips, the parliamentary establishment, the grandees. Now, if your memory is long enough, you'll remember they did this with poor Margaret Thatcher, which was the
Oh
most
yeah.
terrible mistake, because she was really booted out by them at the height of her powers, many of us would say. And the country's gone downhill ever since at a great rate of knots, but never more quickly than since Starmer took office. I mean, never mind the Epstein Mandelson scandal. What about this latest Iran war, where they can't even get a warship to leave harbour that's in good enough condition to start and go for several weeks into the war, let alone the U-turns he's done, whether or not to allow America to use the British bases and so on. It's just appalling. And people in Great Britain, I say Great Britain, it once was, but people in Britain are just so fed up with him, so full of loathing and contempt for him. I can't begin to tell you what the public feeling is at the moment, but how that translates into getting rid of him. It's a bit like Iran, isn't it? Everybody hates the regime, but nobody can get rid of it.
To your point about the apology to the victims really being worthless, you know, there are multiple examples over the last few weeks of the rape gang scandal going completely ignored. Um, as I'm sure that those victims are sitting back going, really? When are you going to address our issues? Uh, it does make it look like he's just trying to save his own butt versus having any sort of real compassion towards any victim whatsoever.
Yes, and this is even more hypocrisy and even more dreadful. Not all our viewers may know about the rape gang scandal, so shall I fill them in a little
Yeah,
bit?
please do. Thank you.
And of course, you now have in Britain at least 5 or 6% of the population that is Muslim, and indeed from the Indian subcontinent. In other words, Indians and Pakistanis by origin. And you have large communities of these new immigrants. I say new, some of them, of course, have been born in Britain to parents who came. But in general, it's a fairly new immigrant community. And you have great concentrations of Indians and Pakistani Muslims in the former industrial cities of the north and northwest of England, particularly. So, for example, just to take a city like Bradford, which was once the absolute world centre of the textile trade, the finest woolen cloth in the world was made in Bradford. But today it's a very sad place and it's very run down and lots of unemployment. And the great majority of people are Pakistani immigrants or people of that origin. Anyway, there has been a tremendous scandal because it has emerged that for many years there have been grooming gangs in a number of these northern cities. That is to say, Pakistanis particularly, and ones who originated in the main from an area of Pakistan called Mirzapur, for whatever reason. And they have been, in a very organized way, these very bad people. Of course, they're a tremendous minority, I'm sure, of the community, but nonetheless, getting everybody else a very bad name because there's been a minority of these Pakistani origin men who have been organizing in a very organized manner to seduce local working class white girls, usually from poor families, often from broken homes, often girls who were in orphanages or in council care homes. Anyway, they've been groomed, they've been given minor presents, they've been given drugs on occasion, and they have been basically sex slaves and raped and trafficked and misused and abused over many, many years. So not only has this happened, but it's emerging in recent times that it's happened with the police turning a blind eye because they didn't want to seen to be seen to be politically incorrect and focusing on Muslim immigrants for their inquiries, with the social workers similarly turning a blind eye and pretending it wasn't happening, with the people running these care homes and orphanages turning a blind eye, and local councils. It goes to such a depth and to such a degree, and it's only now emerging the full scale of it. And different governments, and particularly this latest Labour government, keep talking about a public inquiry, and then they don't, and then they won't, and then they can't find the right person to chair it. And of course, what it needs is a proper judge-led inquiry that will go into this from top to bottom. But they're scared stiff of what will emerge. And what will inevitably emerge is that, yes, these immigrant gangs were preying on white working class girls and sexually abusing them, and that the authorities were turning a blind eye. And of course, that's so politically hot. It's fire. People don't want to hear this, particularly when this present Labour government relies so heavily on the votes of the Muslim community. And indeed, there are 5 independent Muslim MPs in Parliament who support Palestine and support Iran and so on and so forth. And there's a great fear amongst the Labour Party that there will be far more if there's an election held, because the Muslim vote in so many industrial cities of the north and northwest is now so large. In some constituency, it even reaches 40% of the eligible voters. And indeed, there's more than a little evidence of voting fraud that goes on in certain communities, whereby people, the family is being forced into the voting booth and they're all being made to vote uniformly. And worse than that, the postal votes are a tremendous scandal. People are voting more than once with postal votes. So all this sort of thing is going on in Britain. It's now emerging. And yes, it's in that context that Keir Starmer is good enough to apologise today through his back teeth, really, to Epstein's victims, but not a word about the Muslim grooming gangs and their victims, who are far more numerous.
Yeah. It's the classic example of actions speak louder than words. So people are going to have a hard time digesting that apology when they've seen him blatantly ignore or disregard other people's concerns, which has got to be so frustrating. If Starmer were to get the boot, it's almost the concern becomes, the devil, I mean, at least everybody knows what they're getting out of Starmer. I mean, who is in the running to replace him? And is the UK concerned about those individuals? Because how many people have we seen from Starmer's team? They've had to resign, and I don't know what that says about the Labour Party. I remember the redhead with the funky bangs
Yeah.
having to resign because she didn't pay proper taxes on one of her multiple homes. He keeps putting these people in positions of power, and in their niche they seem to be violating the law. I mean, there are multiple examples of that.
This cabinet is so lightweight that one is surprised it doesn't float in the air. But anyway, shall we leave British politics and let's perhaps talk about America, where of course there's great concern, isn't there, that nobody seems to be being prosecuted for the Epstein scandal, whereas at least in Britain, two very high profile figures are being investigated and I would lay a bet will eventually be prosecuted, namely Lord Mandelson and ex-Prince Andrew Mountbatten Windsor.
Yeah.
And why is it that nothing seems to be happening stateside in regard to this scandal where so many other names have come out?
You're absolutely right. There's an interesting piece in Politico, and they discuss this exact topic. And they say the answer might actually be less sensational than people expect. The Justice Department has already released millions of pages of material tied to the Epstein investigation, including emails, court filings, photos, and other records. Um, and this was after Congress passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act in 2025, requiring this disclosure. But the column in Politico argues that documents alone aren't the same as prosecutable evidence. Many of the records are secondhand accounts. I mean, I think immediately when I read that line about the accusations against Trump, a young girl biting, I mean, unverified allegations and references to people who simply appeared in Epstein's social or business orbit. That kind of material often can't meet the legal threshold required for criminal charges. What was your takeaway from the Politico article? What did you think after you read it? Did you think that they had a point?
Yes, Kinsey, I did. You were good enough to say that I've been a very experienced, let me put it that way, a very experienced defending advocate in the criminal courts of Great Britain. And therefore I know, and the public doesn't always realize, two things. The first, I always say, it's so much easier to tell a lie successfully than to catch out a liar. Of course, it happens, but far more rarely than you would want. And it's a difficult process, trust me. People sometimes say to me, oh, but doesn't cross-examination expose a liar? And I like to tell a story from when I was a young barrister. And there's only one time in my long career where I have cross-examined so successfully that the witness has finally admitted on the stand under my withering cross-examination that yes, he is guilty and the man on trial is innocent. So that only happened to me once, and it was when I was defending somebody who was charged with setting fire to a youth club
Wow.
and the premises burnt down. And the main witness against him was saying that he had seen the guy do it. And I cross-examined the main witness, and finally he confessed that it was him who'd set fire to the youth club. It wasn't the man on trial, who was then resoundingly acquitted, and the judge let him leave the court without a stain on his character and all the rest of it. But my triumph, my wonderful cross-examination, is somewhat lessened when I tell you that both parties were 12 years old.
Oh, that's a made for TV movie right there. Okay, I would watch that made for TV movie.
So that's
That's
the only time I've known it happen. Usually, you're just chipping away at a story until it becomes incredible, and it becomes pretty clear that the guy is not telling the truth. But it's a long, patient process of sort of chipping away. It doesn't happen in one great dramatic whoosh like the story I've just told you. So therefore I say that it's so much easier to tell a lie than to catch out a liar. But the second point is, it's so much easier to commit a crime than to catch a criminal. Thank
yeah,
God we do catch some criminals, which deters some others, but not that many.
right.
But the reality is that I think the statistics of successful prosecutions of crime in Britain, the last time I looked, it was something like 6%. So, in other words, 6% of all crimes end up with a criminal verdict and a punishment. So it's so much easier to commit a crime than catch a criminal. Now let's bring that to bear on the Epstein scandal. So certainly, you've had in America a number of high-profile figures who were obviously well mixed up in Epstein's web. And I've just made a note of a few of the names. I mean, there's obviously right at the top of the list in terms of fame and fortune, Bill Clinton. But you've also had a lady called Catherine Rumler, who was the top lawyer with Goldman Sachs and had been a White House counsel to Obama at one time. So she had to resign from Goldman Sachs because she was calling Epstein in the emails Uncle Jeffrey, and they had the most cozy and delightful friendship between them, of course. Then you had, for example, Brad Karp. He's a very well-known attorney, chair of the law firm of Paul Weiss Rifkind, a very white-collar law firm. And he's had to stand down, although he's still a partner there, apparently. You've had Larry Summers, who was Clinton's Treasury Secretary, I think, a former dean of Harvard, and a very distinguished academic. Of course, it doesn't come more distinguished than being a dean of Harvard, great economist. Well, he was a visitor to the island. Indeed, he took his wife to honeymoon there. Can you believe it?
Hmm.
After having been on visits himself before he was with his wife.
Ew.
He liked it so much. And you have Howard Lutnick, who's the Commerce Secretary. He's been on the island, although he says only once for lunch with his wife and kids. You've got Bill Gates, well incriminated in these emails in terms of a close relationship with Epstein. You've got Steve Bannon. You've got a guy called Jess Staley, who's not so well known, but a very important banker, who was head of JP Morgan and at one time Barclays Bank also. So you've got others actually who have been prosecuted, but they're not in America. It's not very well known, but you've got a former prime minister of Norway called Jagland, who's been charged in Norway with gross corruption
Hmm.
arising out of the Epstein
Is that similar
disclosure.
to the Mandelson and the Andrew allegations, government secrets, or some sort of exchange of information? Is that why he was
Yes,
prosecuted in relation to his
yes,
relationship with Epstein?
apparently so. Although be it said that they're being very cagey there and they're not releasing much detail.
Hmm.
Their system tends to be far less porous than our systems are in terms of leaks as to what it's all about. So we don't really know too much about it, but he has been charged with gross corruption. He says he's innocent. He was once head of the Nobel Prize Committee, by the way. Can you believe it?
I can.
You've got a crown princess there. So just as you've got Andrew, the royal member in Britain, you've got Crown Princess Mette Marit, who's had to apologize publicly for being on such close and intimate terms with Epstein. And then you've got two Norwegian diplomats, Mona Jewel, that's the wife, and Rad Larson. So the Larsons, they've also been charged with gross corruption. They say they're innocent, you'll be pleased to know. But interestingly enough, their children received millions of dollars in Epstein's will. Lucky kids, young kids. So Norway seems to be taking it seriously, let me put it that way. But none of the famous names, and there are others, that I've mentioned in America seem to be in any danger of prosecution. Now, why is it? Well, firstly, that because you're mentioned in an Epstein email, and even if you mentioned, let's take Bill Gates as an example, you've got these emails where it seems to be suggested that Epstein was counseling him on how to have affairs with Russian ladies and finding Russian ladies for him. And it seems to be suggested that one of these ladies even gave him an unpleasant case of a certain type of disease.
No, thank you.
And it seems to be the case that that there was a plan whereby Bill Gates would feed antibiotics to his wife, Melinda Gates, without her knowing, in her food, in order to make sure she didn't catch it as well.
Oh my
Pretty
gosh. Which
extraordinary.
we should stress that Bill Gates says that this is not true, but still
Oh,
it's laid out.
everybody says it's not true.
The way that it's laid out is a little too specific for us. Okay. It makes us a little uncomfortable. We'll say that much.
It certainly does. But is this evidence that can be used in court were Bill Gates ever to be prosecuted? The short answer is, of course not. In courts, you have to have a witness. You have to have the girl who says I was abused or raped or sexually assaulted, or as the case may be.
Well, in Melinda Gates' case, they would probably need some form of toxicology to prove that she had been consuming something against her will.
Oh, you'd need all this sort of stuff. And of course, you're never going to get it as a prosecutor. And these kind of women in general don't want to come forward. They've had enough. They're embarrassed. They don't need the publicity. If there's one thing worse than being raped, from a long experience of such trials, I can tell you, it's being the witness in a rape case and having everything thrown at you and being called a liar. You go through the ordeal a second time, and the second time can be worse than the first because it's so long drawn out and the process is so ill-equipped to deal with these allegations, and it's incredibly traumatic for these victims. So if they've got any sense at all, they normally don't want to be involved and say enough's enough. And that seems to be the case here, because recently released was a long FBI report, which I read last night. It had many redactions, and it was very long. I think it was about 90 pages. It took me a long time to read it carefully. But what was very apparent was the FBI had interviewed girl after girl after girl who had allegedly been on Epstein's island or in his Palm Beach pad or in his wonderful townhouse in Manhattan or in the wonderful ranch in New Mexico. Often they'd been in all four, actually, and they'd traveled on his plane, the Lolita Express, as it was termed. All right, and girl after girl was interviewed. And what was noticeable was they were all saying, it's too embarrassing for us to go there. We don't want to give the detail. We'll tell you in general terms what he did to us. But frankly, it's too traumatic to go in. So these girls are not going to come forward as witnesses. And the one who was most forthcoming, apparently, was that lady Virginia Jofra, the one who says she was trafficked to Prince Andrew several times in London. And she, of course, is now dead. She committed suicide tragically last year. So for all these reasons, the documents don't prove a case. They don't begin to prove a case. There's even a further difficulty, actually, if I'm going to get technical, that these emails with all the redactions, you've got to have a witness to prove that they were to Epstein and from Epstein, and that they were received. This kind of thing doesn't prove itself. Just because I flourish a bit of paper that says Kinsey sent me an email, it might be a forgery. It
Mm.
might not be you at all. It might be somebody else with a similar name. So these things don't prove themselves. It's good enough for a newspaper article, of course, but to bring a prosecution where you have to have evidence that shows guilt beyond reasonable doubt, that's something else.
Well, and another thing that the article pointed out, but it's also something I believe you've said to me recently, is the difficulty in building a case so many years later. I mean, decades, decades old emails and photos and paperwork, which means prosecutors face issues like expired status, statutes of limitation, like you said, unavailable witnesses, and evidence that might not exist anymore. I mean, who knows what's been lost throughout the last few years of them investigating Jeffrey Epstein. So, I mean, I guess we're Politico, and we are trying to manage public expectation that while people really want justice, they might not get it in the States beyond Ghislaine Maxwell.
I think Ghislaine Maxwell is the only scalp that will be had. That's what it's looking like to me. Uh, she's really the fall girl for everything, because had Epstein not committed suicide, it's even possible she would have been given immunity to be a witness against him. I think
Wow.
that's really quite likely that a deal would have been done, or certainly a far lesser sentence than the 20 years she got. But as you rightly say, delay is a tremendous problem for any prosecutor. And we have a saying at the defense bar that delay always helps the defense. So, just to take an example, again, you're absolutely right when you say what has only been lost in terms of evidence. Let's just take an example. A girl says, as these girls, and by the way, the pattern that emerges from the FBI report is one of great consistency between all these girls, many of whom didn't know each other. Some did, but most didn't. And the consistency of the story, they'd be picked up from a school or a dance or some Starbucks, places where young people would congregate, and Ghislaine Maxwell would come in and start talking to them and befriend them. They were often girls from broken homes or unhappy homes. There were occasionally girls who were literally living on the street.
This is sounding just like the grooming gangs
Exactly.
scenario, by the way.
It's a sort of American equivalent, and I suppose one could say slightly more larded with money, because these girls in England were very, very poor. Here, at least, they could afford a coffee at Starbucks or whatever it might be. But they would be given $200-300, usually 300, to give Epstein once they got the girl to the house. The one thing that they all had in common was they were pretty young girls. Of course, they had to be under the age of consent, or he wasn't interested. Older girls he would dismiss and say, that's not for me, because he was a paedophile, simple as that. But they would be introduced, they'd be shown by Ghislaine how he liked his dirty massages, they'd be told to do whatever he liked on his massage table, in his wonderful massage room that he had with all the accoutrements, and then he would play with them as he fancied. Right. Now, if this had been a recent prosecution, inevitably, they were saying, for example, he would come to climax. Let me choose my words carefully. There would, if this were a recent prosecution, there'd be the possibility of forensic evidence. There'd be the used tissue, for example. There'd be the fingerprints. There'd be the items left on the floor, the sex toys, whatever it might be. All that you could expect in a recent rape or sexual assault prosecution. But 20 years later, forget it. What have you got left?
Well,
Only
also
girl's word.
once he realized that they were on his tail, I imagine that he started getting rid of any and all evidence that he could. There are reports, and I think it was in the Telegraph 2 or 3 weeks ago, that he rented multiple storage units in Florida where the Telegraph wonders if there could be security video that he took around his house or additional photographs or any additional evidence. But once he realized that they were gunning for him hard, I wonder if a lot of evidence was simply destroyed to protect to protect himself.
Well, my point to you, Kinsey, is that in sex cases, there isn't much other evidence anyway. What are you going to
Yeah,
have? A
yeah,
used
yeah.
tissue? Well, that gets flushed away. A sex toy that gets thrown away. Uh, you're not. He's not suggested to have filmed himself. Unfortunately, none of the girls
But I do
claim.
think that they believe that he might have security video of other people that he had held on to for blackmail purposes. Is what Andrew Lowney and a couple of other uh, investigators have suggested, that there might be security footage that Andrew Mountbatten Windsor doesn't know exists of him with one of these girls because Epstein wanted it as backup in case Andrew ever did something to, challenge him.
That I find quite likely. Of course, Andrew Lowney has been a fantastic investigator of these matters and writes very well about them. So I find all that quite credible because, after all, what we do know is that Epstein kept compromising photos, took thousands of photos. For example, most recently, Mandelson in his underpants and in
I
his
can't get it out of my
bathrobe.
mind. It is seared. I close my eyes before I go to sleep at night and I see his tidy whities, Jonathan. Make
It's
it
pretty
stop.
horrid, isn't it? It's pretty horrid. And for example, Bill Clinton enjoying his jacuzzi. Now, why were these photos taken? But then apparently catalogued very carefully and filed very carefully in the Manhattan house when the FBI arrived to raid the safe. Why were they in the safe?
I,
So, absolutely, I agree with you that this was what the Russians call compromat, keeping compromising material that may come in handy later if you need to influence a person of importance.
mm,
So there may well be much more, and maybe in these locked storage units that you mentioned, if they could only find them and get in there, yes, there may be all sorts of other people and all sorts of compromising material on those other people beyond what we even know.
mm.
Wouldn't it be interesting to find out? But whether there will be actual proof of rape, I find very doubtful. So even, for example, the famous photo of Andrew with his arm round Virginia Joffe, where he before he paid her 12 million for her silence, or before Mummy paid 12 million for her silence, which didn't even work, but that's another story. Um, he was claiming, wasn't he? Oh, that's not my arm, that's not my hands, my fingers, and
It's a
all this
picture
crap.
of a picture of a picture. Yeah,
Yes,
he had all
it's
sorts
a
of
fake
excuses.
photo, and I can't sweat and was at the pizza house anyway. All this stuff. So that photo um, wouldn't prove and doesn't prove that he raped the girl, particularly because um, she's not there to give the story to a court of law.
Mm.
Um,
And then even if she was, he's not there. It's not, well, he is here. I mean, Epstein's gone, but it's his word against hers. And I don't think you'd ever get him on a stand.
well, you would if he was prosecuted criminally. He wouldn't have any
But can't
option, I think.
he in the UK he would have to testify. In the United States you get the choice as to whether or not you want to testify or not.
No, you're quite right. You get the same choice in the UK because, after all, your system is largely modelled and inherited from ours. So you do get the choice, but with this important nuance, which I often discuss with my American trial lawyer friends. There's a very important nuance that in America, the default position is don't call your client, don't give them the chance to show he's lying in his evidence. But in Britain, for whatever cultural reason or legal reason, it's very, very different.
Mm.
If you don't call your client in a serious criminal case, where there's a case against him to start with, you're very likely to be convicted. And so we invariably
Wow.
do call our clients. We take the risk and we put them on the stand to give their denials. One of the reasons may be that there is this difference in the law in America and in Britain, that in Britain, if the defendant does not give evidence, the jury are entitled to ask themselves, is he not giving evidence because he has something to fear from cross-examination? In America, the jury are directed they may not ask themselves that same question. So that may be the reason why we invariably call our clients. So trust me, if Andrew were accused of the sex offence with Joffre or indeed any of the other girls, in that very unlikely eventuality, because I can't see it ever happening, they simply don't have the evidence for the sex crimes against Andrew, he would be giving evidence. But I don't think it's going to happen because I don't see any case against him. A photo with your arm around a 17-year-old girl who might have been delighted to sleep with a prince doesn't prove you
Although,
raped her.
no, that's a very good point. But what a nightmare to imagine that man on the stand. He is so arrogant. He's so entitled. He's so unlikable. And I feel like you can tell. I mean, it's like a classic dad. I've had my dad be like, when you over lie or when you over explain, I can tell you're lying.
Yeah.
And that's Andrew Mountbatten with I was at Pizza Express. I don't sweat. It happened in the Falklands. Like you're over explaining. We know you're lying.
He was the most terrible witness, wasn't he, in that car crash interview with Emily Maitlis?
Yes, it was appalling.
It was appalling. I mean, it was the best. It was the best entertainment in town, of course. And I think Emily Maitlis, if she ever wanted a second career, would go to the bar because she was just such a brilliant cross-examiner in that interview. I thought I really gave her full marks.
Well, let's do an entire episode on the history of Ghislaine Maxwell because I do think that that's very interesting, but I think we would not be doing her or her family justice by trying to wrap it up in the last few minutes of this podcast. Her father has a fascinating history, and the way that his web is entangled with so many of today's prominent individuals is interesting as well. So we will save that for another day. But a fascinating conversation about what's happened in the last week since we last spoke about this story. It's not going anywhere. But again, we are trying to manage expectations. And the reality is, we will get more and more information. We'll see more emails, perhaps, and we'll see um, plenty of redacted files. But no one's probably going to be held accountable for any of the new information that we receive.
Well, you know my view on this, Kinsey, which is that you will see prosecutions in England against Mandelson and against Andrew. I mean, I'll stick my neck out and say I expect to see it. I've been wrong before, not too often. I expect to see it, but only for I say only for the serious offence of misconduct in public office.
Mm-hmm.
That's to say, leaking market sensitive information to Epstein from their official positions. In Mandelson's case, when he was a cabinet minister in 2009, and in Andrew's case, when he was the special envoy for trade and industry for 10 years in the first decade of the 2000s. I think you're going to see that. And believe me, they're going to be long and complicated and interesting trials, if so. There'll be
Wait,
plenty
would
to.
that would we see Andrew on the stand then?
Yes, I think it's very likely.
Oh my gosh,
Same
the
thing.
poor royal family, the poor royal family.
Absolutely. If he's prosecuted, if he's taken to the criminal jury trial, I think he'll have to give evidence. I mean, really, I'm crossing many bridges to get there, but I think he will have to. But as you say, it'll be great to discuss with you the Ghislaine case uh, in another episode, because, you know, that's a girl giving you the bottom line, as it were, now, or you would say the headline. That's a girl who I almost feel sorry for in some respects. I
Wow.
almost think she didn't have a chance in life.
Wow.
She had the kind of father that nightmares are made of. And then she found in Epstein a sort of father figure that was not dissimilar to the real father she had. So, anyway, sufficient unto the day. But you're right, that will be a fascinating discussion.
Oh, well, agree with us, disagree with us. We want to hear your thoughts as well. Let us know in the comments. Make sure you like and subscribe and leave us a positive review, 5 stars if you're listening to this, not on YouTube. And Jonathan, what a pleasure to pick your brain. You're so knowledgeable. I look forward to talking to you again next week.
Me too.
All right. Thanks, everyone.